Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Carrie Ann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts. And this is a talk show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community. And today we're going to be talking about postpartum depression. I have with me today Ms. Sasha Nicole. I'm going to just read a little bit about her. For moms who feel stuck and stagnant in life, Sasha Nicole teaches how to feel more confident and courageous through various courses, motivational videos, coaching, and keynote speeches. As a mental health advocate in the wellness industry for over 10 years, who not only survives severe postpartum depression and thrives with a mental health condition, it is her mission to assist others in living a healed and whole life while honing in on what truly makes you happy. So welcome to the show, Sasha Nicole.
Hi, Dr. Williams. Thank you so much for having me.
So Sasha, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So essentially, as you mentioned, at one point, I experienced severe postpartum depression. It was that experience that prompted me to become a mental health advocate. From there, I've just been doing a lot of motivational speeches, coaching, courses, and a variety of things to help other moms who are feeling the same way. I also started a nonprofit, Partum Evolution, to help specifically women of color who are experiencing postpartum depression. And so that's what I do, on the side. I still work my 9 to 5, but that is mainly what my mission and focus is.
Okay, amazing. So guys, I kind of did a little bit of background here on postpartum depression. And I went to the NAMI website, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And so it's a good resource for any of you out there that are looking for information on just on mental health issues. The NAMI website says that postpartum depression affects 1 in 8 new mothers, 1 in 8. So it's not an uncommon thing, but the risk is significantly higher for new mothers of color. And notably, while Black women are more likely to have postpartum depression, they're less likely to receive help just as a whole. And there's a lot of different factors and reasons why there is some increased risk for women of color. Sometimes it has to do with their educational level, sometimes high stress living environments, exposure to trauma, food insecurity, lack of access to quality healthcare coverage. That's according to NAMI. And then they also noted that many reasons that folks don't seek help, sometimes it's a stigma, perceptions of mental illness in the Black community. Sometimes it's just a lack of representation in healthcare. So people just don't see folks that look like them that have these conditions. And so they just don't really realize it could happen to them. There could be a distrust of the healthcare system, that they, don't trust the healthcare system to take care of them. And there's a lot of validity to that, given the maternal kind of mortality rate in the US. And then there's perceived racial discrimination, and as well as experience with inaccurate diagnoses. So if you've had experience where you're misdiagnosed by your healthcare providers, then you're less likely to seek help in the future. So, and these are just a few of the reasons that NAMI cited. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on that part of the reason that I, really even wanted to talk about postpartum depression. One is, of course, so you guys would know about it and know how to recognize it. But it's of particular importance in the Black community for us to be able to recognize this and take action on it. And so in the show today, we're going to talk about what postpartum depression looks like and also what you need to know about it. And, Sasha, as you mentioned, you had your own journey, your own personal journey with postpartum symptoms. Tell us your story.
So essentially, when I had my daughter, after I had her, I ended up having emergency C-section. Once I had her, I was able to latch, I was able to breastfeed, but I felt no sense of connection. So there was no, as they mention, or you sometimes see in the movies, or you hear a lot of moms talk about, and they'll say, it was the best day of my life. I felt, butterflies and joy. For me, I didn't feel any of that. I didn't feel any type of connection for her. I didn't want to feel touched by her. I didn't want to touch her. It was just nothing there. And I felt very saddened by that because I felt that was strange. I didn't think that was a normal feeling to have. But I thought maybe it was just in this moment. Maybe I was just tired after the surgery, something like that. But it lasted. It was ongoing, and it lasted for almost 2 years, a little over 2 years, where I literally just had no connection with my daughter. The only thing that I felt was a sense of obligation in terms of taking care of her, being her mother. And so it was a really hard battle because as we both know, children do have needs. They do need to be touched. They do need affection. They do need a variety of different things. And in that moment, I just felt like I was incapable of providing those things, especially, when she would reach out to try to be held or touched, and I just would freeze up and didn't want to do that. And then after that, probably in the second year, I started to have a lot of thoughts about harming her. So I would walk past the steps and I'd want to throw her down the steps. I would want to throw her against the wall. I'd imagine doing things in sense of getting rid of her. And I didn't know at that point, I really didn't know what to do and how to handle or manage those thoughts or who to tell them to, because my biggest fear was that they'd take my child away. And I didn't want to have them take her away. I just didn't know what was taking place within my body. And I didn't have anyone or any resources at that time to tell me that this was something, that postpartum depression was something that I was experiencing.
Wow. You mentioned feeling this fear when it came to, sharing what you were experiencing with other people, because you said, oh my gosh, how are other people going to interpret this? Are they going to take my child away? Tell us a little bit about how anxiety kind of plays into some of the postpartum experience.
No, that's a great question. I had a lot of anxiety about that because I was always afraid, when you go to do your checkups after you have a child, you go to the doctor, you take the child to the doctor, and you go quite a few times, especially as the child is an infant. And they do ask you a few questions here and there. And I remember my OB asking me, how I was feeling, and she ran down kind of like this common list. And once she got to the part of, are you having thoughts about this? Or are you feeling that? I was like, no, because I just in that moment was like, if I say this to this woman, what's going to happen? And so the first time I said no. The second time I eventually was like, well, I'm kind of feeling like I'm not really connected. I feel very down. And so her immediate reaction was like, okay, and she just prescribed me Prozac. But there was no sense of conversation. There was no sense of relatability. There was no sense of, well, tell me more about that. And what does that look like? And then I felt like, well, if I did go more into it, what would happen from there? So there was a lot of anxiety about what I should share and what I shouldn't share. And then a few of my friends, my closest friends at the time, when I did share a little bit of what I was experiencing, their first initial reaction was like, oh, you're tripping, or you're crazy, or I remember my own father saying, well, you're not the only mother in the world, get over it. And so it just continued to increase the anxiety levels that I had, but not only the anxiety, but it just continued to put me further whole in the depression that I was experiencing, because I felt like there was no one that I could talk to.
Did you notice any changes in other things like motivation to, to take care of yourself? I know sometimes depression comes with this sense of just feeling tired and not eating enough. Did you notice any symptoms like that?
Absolutely. So there was a lot of moments where it's like, I just didn't want to do anything. I wasn't happy about anything. I cried a lot for sometimes no reason and had no clue why I was crying. I mean, it could just literally be an outburst and I had no idea. And I'd be like, I don't know why I'm crying. A lot of the things that I would once enjoy, as they mentioned in postpartum depression, very similar to regular depression, the things that you usually find joy in or that you used to enjoy, you don't normally enjoy anymore. Very irritable, very just upset a lot. And so those were a lot of the actual symptoms that I was experiencing. And those are a lot of the symptoms that other women can experience when they're also going through postpartum depression.
Now, did you have, because you were also married at the time too, did you have a spouse that was supportive?
So unfortunately at that time, my spouse, my daughter's father, very different in the frame of mind of thinking. In his mind, he felt like, similar to what my father had said, you're her mother. This is what you're supposed to do. Just get over it. I don't understand what the problem is. So there wasn't a sense of understanding of what I was actually experiencing or going through. It was just seen as though, you just need to get over it.
Did you have other family members helping you out, like giving you a break if you needed a break with childcare?
So my mom, I was in Virginia at the time. My mother was in Seattle. So I didn't have anyone. And then, my father's train of mind, it was, of course he wasn't going to provide the break because he felt like I just needed to get through it anyway. And I always say, people oftentimes when people are reaching out for help and they may receive that feedback or that answer, everyone may say that until something actually happens. So if I had actually harmed my child, I don't think that a lot of people would have said, well, then it would have been, well, that's so unfortunate. I can't believe that she did that. But there were moments where, I'm reaching out for help. I'm crying for help. I'm saying that this is what I'm experiencing. So I didn't receive the breaks that I should have, which is really important when we're speaking about postpartum depression, is that you really need a network and a community of support. You really do, especially if you are experiencing that. You need support in general after a child. But during this time of postpartum depression, having support is a huge just benefit. I had a best friend whose mom she was a nurse, I actually ended up talking to her, and she ended up coming and staying with me for a few days, and she helped me out during those days, which was a huge blessing, because I felt like also during that time, because there's two types of postpartum depression. And then also a less severe where you're having maybe just the baby blues, where you're just feeling a little down, but this temporarily goes away after about 3 to 6 months. But for me, you have the postpartum depression where you feel like no one can touch your child. You're the only one who can do everything. You don't trust anyone. You're overbearing, overprotective about the baby. And then you have mine where you just don't even want to touch the baby. And so part of that also is that when she would cry, I would get so upset and so angry and so frustrated because I felt like nothing I was doing would stop her from crying. So those are also symptoms that you can have when you're hearing the child cry, and the level of anger that I would feel in terms of her crying at that time. So when she came and helped me out, it was just a godsend, because she took over, and she just really gave me that moment and that break to just kind of, just have a moment to myself.
It kind of, I'm thinking back to what you mentioned as the experience you had with a OB/GYN, and how when you mentioned having some feelings of being down, they're just like, oh, okay, let's just prescribe a medication and then just take it. Is that kind of a take 2 of these and give me a call in the morning, or
Yes.
that sort of thing. And that makes me feel so sad, because usually any kind of decision to prescribe medications is a conversation. And in psychiatry, we talk about a more comprehensive plan surrounding medications, but sometimes when psychiatric medications are prescribed by primary care providers like OB/GYNs, they don't necessarily have that lengthy discussion. And it makes me think again about disparities in healthcare. Is it that that's kind of how it always is, or is it that there are some people that just get prescribed medications without a discussion? ? There is some research to show that women in general, sometimes they're not listened to in healthcare, and also that some physicians have a whether they're male or female, kind of a paternalistic kind of approach, where they just say, well, here's how it goes, and then take this, and there's not much of a discussion. I wonder what your experience was like, I guess, with the healthcare system.
So for me, when I had my daughter, I want to say that I had some great nurses who were really excellent. I had one nurse who was very, very cruel to me. But for the most part, my experience after having her, during having her, was pretty good. The doctor who was there prior to my OB arriving was very, as you mentioned, that kind of paternalistic in terms of when I kept saying that, I'm in pain, like there's something wrong, or the expression of certain things, it wasn't all the way received. I don't know. I can't speak for why. I will say that doctor did happen to be white, as opposed to my OB, who was a Black woman. And I specifically wanted to have a Black woman. But I will say that even in receiving care from sometimes even our own Black doctors, there's still sometimes, as you mentioned, there's that lack of conversation in certain things. And especially in childbirth, what happens and what they don't, a lot of times, what a lot of people don't understand is that their intention is to get you in and to get you out. So a lot of times you don't have just the same, that time in that conversation. For her, I think that when I mentioned, and it was kind of like, well, here's a prescription, give me a call. Again, I think that there was just a lack of understanding as to, what this really is and what is really happening. Because, as I was saying, there's also, when I mentioned the different types of postpartum, there's also postpartum psychosis, where when you are actually having thoughts of harming the kid, but then you actually go through with it. And so you're in this psychosis state of postpartum depression. I think that I can't say that I had the worst level of care for disparity, but I can say that there were certain things where I felt like, is this happening because I'm young? Is this happening because I'm Black? Am I not being listened to, or people kind of feel like, here you go. Like, is there a specific reason for that? I don't know. But I am glad that I didn't have a moment where, it just, when certain things were happening, that people just let everything fall by the wayside in terms of during my actual delivery, because we hear stories like Serena Williams, who was saying, I'm in severe pain, and no one would listen, to her. And this is Serena Williams, right? So, so yeah, there are definitely moments, but in that moment didn't. But I've definitely experienced moments where I've been in a system where I'm expressing something, and I've had different OBs where I've expressed, because I have PCOS, where I've expressed pain and it completely goes ignored. So this is a real thing that happens to a lot of moms, especially in underserved communities. This happens a lot. So.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. Pain in general, for I guess for many reasons, in individuals of color, it just is interpreted differently by healthcare professionals. There was some studies. I don't have the exact kind of dates about it, but they were polling like medical students and asked them questions about whether they felt like people of various skin tones experience pain differently.
Mm-hmm.
Good percentage of them thought they did.
Yes.
They thought that, maybe Black skin is thicker, or, just kind of really, I don't know how to describe it, untrue, outdated, kind of like historic kind of like ideas.
This happens, I think, still to this day, where it's seen as Black people have a higher level of tolerance for pain than their counterparts, which is absurd, but it's a lot of people really believe that.
And so then it trickles into, you're in the delivery room and you have just as much pain as everybody else, but they somehow, this perception is that you can handle more, or I don't know what it is. There's a part of me that wonders, is there maybe a thought that Black people are drug seeking? What really kind of is the hesitation? I think it may be different for different providers when they have their hesitation, but it's the eventual effect is that people are not given the right amount of medication for them to be comfortable and have a less stressful delivery experience.
Right.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious to know, as you kind of began to learn more about what you were really going through, and tell us about that process of when you kind of realized, oh my gosh, this is kind of like a thing, and this is what I need to do to help myself. Like, tell us about that process of how you came out of this.
Right. So as I was experiencing during the moments where I'm feeling depressed, where I'm having these outbursts of crying spells, I still at that moment didn't even know that it was postpartum depression. As I started to have the thoughts of harming her, at this point, I started to do my own research, and I did start to, as I mentioned, when I had told my OB, well, I'm having really down thoughts, and I wouldn't go as far as to say in harming her. But when she mentioned it could be that was the moment where I finally heard the word postpartum depression. Because prior to that time, I still hadn't even heard that word before. I hadn't even heard of it. I didn't know what it was and exist. And you'd be surprised to know that there are a lot of people who really don't know what postpartum depression is, and who have a lack of belief in women actually experiencing the magnitude that they can go through after childbirth, especially fathers, especially a lot of just, sometimes even women in general who didn't have that experience after childbirth. So they have a lack of understanding as to the correlation as to the hormonal changes that can happen. And so as I started to finally learn the word, I did a lot of research. There was at the time, there was no support groups or anything in my area to help me or someone to talk to. And I did eventually seek therapy and finding someone where I could, have some sort of therapy in expressing what I was going through and how I was feeling. And so that was the beginning of just starting in terms of just helping me get out of this. I hate to be cliche about saying this part, but I honestly used to just pray all the time that God, please take these feelings away from me in terms of wanting to harm my child. I'm not an advocate for saying that, prayer is going to remove postpartum depression, but it was definitely part of my process along with therapy. I didn't end up taking the medication because at the time I was not open to taking medication for anything that was considered depression. I probably still had antiquated thoughts on psychiatric drugs myself. And I was very scared of that. And it would just take consistent time, a lot of research, a lot of reading. And I would force myself to try to touch her. I would force myself to try to be near her, to just really try to get through this. And after about the 2-year mark, there was an incident where, and I don't know what made the switch happen particularly, but there was an incident where we were driving. I had my daughter in the back seat, and we were driving past this incredible car accident where it really looked that there had to probably have been some fatality. And I, in that moment, thought, wow, if that was me, I hope that she could live if I didn't. And it was like a switch that almost just kind of changed in that moment where I actually started to have a sense of feeling for her, and seeing something that was so traumatic made me think of the feeling that I finally wanted to have as a mom, in feeling like I would do anything, or I would sacrifice anything for my child. And that was really honestly the beginning of the start of me doing a lot of research, becoming an advocate, and then having my own nonprofit to provide resources and groups to women of color who are experiencing postpartum. So now I'm much more open to psychiatric drugs to help, because it has been proven that they really do help people. So I hope for anyone listening who maybe I'm on the fence about that, it can help, but definitely you want to have the conversation in the type of drug that you may be considering taking.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the key, is like the conversation.
Right.
That's how you determine if something is right for you. And you get the information, like what are the risks, what are the benefits, what do I expect in terms of how long it's going to take to work, just kind of these basic questions. Am I going to need to take this for a long time? Am I going to be able to stop this, and if so, when? Can I breastfeed if I take it?
Mm-hmm.
This sort of thing. There's a lot of questions that maybe if people have the right discussion, then they might have their questions answered and feel more comfortable with it. Or after having all the information, maybe they decide they still don't want it, but at least they had the conversation. And as you mentioned, there is a lot of research to support having, medication and therapy, especially at the beginning stages when things are the toughest, with all those hormonal changes. And over time, you might, be able to potentially come off, or, that sort of thing. So,
and I did a lot of writing. I did think about the just journaling. It was the idea of journaling, and I would write a lot about what I was feeling and what I was going through, and that was helpful as well.
Yeah. So kind of thinking through all these different strategies for what you can do to help yourself. So I think it's a very remarkable story, and as you mentioned, eventually reading about it, learning about it is a key, and then reaching out, getting that therapy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And so, just to kind of reiterate for folks that may be listening, after childbirth, it can be normal to have some changes in mood. But when you get to that point where you are really worried about the kinds of mood changes, maybe you're really crying more than you can really understand, like why you're crying so much. You maybe potentially having thoughts that you wouldn't expect that you would have. What other things should people kind of look for as signs that maybe they should talk to?
When you're overly stressed, when you're extremely anxious, as I mentioned, as you just mentioned as well, when you're crying repeatedly with that, and then also not necessarily understanding why you're feeling the way that you're feeling, why you're crying the way that you're crying, when you are in a state where you are very overprotective in terms of like overly, you don't want anyone to do anything, in terms of you don't want anyone to touch anything or even help assist you in any way. When you are having feelings of just sadness and with some other things, just in general, anything that is a change from what you would normally do or feel is something that you may want to watch out for and consider, especially if it's consistently happening and ongoing. So those are some things that you definitely want to look out for the changes that may be taking place and that they're extended. Because if the changes, you're going to have some changes, but when the changes are continuing and they don't seem to have an end date in near, then that's at that time you may want to look into, am I experiencing postpartum depression? Is this something that I should be worried about? Of course, if you're having any thoughts of harming yourself or harming your child as well.
And now in your case, a lot of what you experienced lasted up to 2 years.
Yes.
And now, was there any kind of, during that 2 years, do you feel like when you look back, if you had known what was going on sooner and been able to take action sooner, do you feel like it would have reduced the length of time that you had that experience?
I do think that if I had been more knowledgeable and had more resources and support around me, I do think that this could have been something that would have not lasted as long. But in going through it by myself, I think that was a huge reason as to why it extended the way that it did. I think that I would have had a better chance or opportunity of it not lasting for the time frame that it did.
There's something else that you had mentioned, which you mentioned like when you had gone past this car accident, that it kind of like caused a switch. Mm-hmm. And it kind of just made me think about how sometimes the threat of losing someone, it just brings up in your mind how much you realize that you really, really love them, because they talk, they do that in like Hollywood movies all the time, where they don't know they're in love with someone else. And then when they are about to lose them, they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how much I was in love with you. Yes. And it seems as though you kind of had like a kind of a little moment like that, where you're like, oh my gosh, my daughter, I didn't realize how much I was really in love with her. Like, oh my gosh, I would never want to lose her.
It does. I mean, it's a weird thing, but it's a great point that you brought up, that sometimes, and especially with you being a psychiatrist, that oftentimes there are things or trauma that we may have to see or experience that triggers something else. Yeah. So it's kind of similar to if something happened to you as a child with glass shattering, and then as an adult you hear that same sound, it will trigger something. And so for me, seeing the loss of life just made me have this trigger of seeing something so traumatic. It did make me feel a way that I had not felt before. So it was very much that experience of thinking, man, how would I feel if she really, wasn't here? If she did die, if I did harm her, what would I then feel then? And it just triggered these overwhelming emotions that I had not experienced before at the thought of not having her at all.
Wow. And it's interesting, because I said, just as much as medications are helpful, that was like stronger than any medication,
Yes, that experience was stronger than anything, because I haven't forgot it, or in the level of emotion that I felt of that moment of me feeling as though like this came from me. This is a part of me. And I do want her to be here, and I wanted to be a better mom. I wanted to have the connection. I desperately wanted to have it. I just didn't know how or why I wasn't experiencing it.
Yeah. Wow. So tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Right. So I have a lot of the various different things going on. And so what I do have a podcast and I'm a co-host. It's called American Therapy, and that's American with a K. And we talk about all things Black mental health. And so I have actually branched off in terms of starting my own brand, where I do a lot of recordings and motivational speaking and videos and just little tidbits here and there for 5 to 10 minutes. And that brand is called Fearless Influence. And the influence starts with the N. And essentially, it's just dedicated to encouraging the confidence and mental wellness in the lives of others. And I talk about a variety of things. And you can find that at fearlessinfluence.com. And again, the influence starts with the N instead of IN. And you'll see a variety of just the videos and things that I'm talking about and that I'm putting out weekly.
All right, yeah. And so, guys, I can vouch for it. I checked out her website. I listened to some of her episodes, and just some good content out there. So I would recommend you guys checking that out. If you want more information about postpartum depression, Sasha Nicole is an advocate and provides education on that. Can people reach you through your website as well if they,
Absolutely. If you specifically want to reach out to me for the postpartum depression, I have my 501c3, my nonprofit. And it's called Partum Evolution. And so partumevolution.org, you can go there. There's a variety of different resources for you that you can find out about. I'm also finalizing a documentary that's dedicated to women of color who've experienced postpartum depression. So there are a lot of things coming through that, as well as different programming. If you're in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, I do plan on trying to extend out to some other areas, or if you'd be interested in having me come to your area and maybe do some sort of programming, again, you can go to that website. You can reach me and contact me through there as well if you specifically want to discuss postpartum depression. So.
Cool. And I think I saw a little teaser on your website for
it is. You can see a little bit of the snippets of the video as well.
But it's really intriguing. I hope that when it's done, we'll have a chance to kind of to watch that. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing your story. I know it can't be easy to kind of to be transparent, but it helps other people, because someone listening might be thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that other people go through that, So I think the work you're doing will help a lot of people out there.
No, thank you so much. Thank you again for having me. And I definitely hope so. It's my mission and aim to help others and to be okay with being more transparent and vulnerable about their experience. So thank you again. I really appreciate it.
And I thank all of you out there for listening. You were listening to Black Mental Health Matters.